All right, going live a minute early. It's a particularly busy time of the year, so we'll wait and see whether some other people show up. In the meantime, you can see my bookshelf that I know so many people are fascinated by behind me. You can probably also hear sirens in the distance. We live not too far from a fire station and from Milwaukee Police District 1. So those are a not constant, but often happening thing. So I haven't done one of these political theory and practice discussions for a while, in part because I've been so busy with coursework and Stoicon and all these other stuff going on. But this one is one I've been looking forward to for a while. And it's something that I think can be very useful for a non American audience in understanding why American politics and culture is the way it is, but I think it can also be incredibly useful for a lot of people within the American context who don't understand why change can't be produced or accountability can't be demanded as easily. And a lot of it has to do with what we can call, in a very broad sense, localism. That's not really the right word for it, in part because localism typically means like focusing on local politics, local issues affecting change at a local level. In this case, we're talking about something that's a structural aspect of American culture, politics, economics, all these things connected up. And I chose as my theme, there is no system, because when it comes to many of the things that we talk about in politics, and we want to, express dissatisfaction about, or the need for change, or any of these sorts of things, we often talk in terms of the system. And I think in a lot of countries, there really is a the system for that sort of thing. So the three things that I wanted to focus on as examples of this are education, healthcare, and policing and criminal justice, which would include prisons as well. There is no system in America for any of those. There are systems in other places. So when we talk about a national healthcare system, for example, in Great Britain, there really is a national healthcare system. And it may be fragmented in certain ways, and there may be problems with it. And sometimes people fall through the cracks and stuff like that. But there is a system, there is a set of governmental agencies, there are rules that apply across the board. There is the possibility of taking bad actors and giving them sanctions, removing them from the system. There are possibilities of changing the system through legislation, or through the way the executive works, or just the way the governmental agencies structure themselves. We can say similar things about there being in many countries a education system, and it may have outliers, like there may be religious schools that don't fit into the governmental system. In some cases, religious schools even do fit into the governmental system, and there is an educational system. So, for example, some of my videos have been used as part of the Portuguese national curriculum, which includes some philosophy in the 10th and 11th grade. There's a system there, right? We can also talk about this in terms of policing. There, and again, we'll use Great Britain as an example. You can be, a police officer assigned to a department or district or whatever they call them up in the north of England, or you can be, down in the very southern part. You can be in a city, you can be in the countryside, but you belong to a national system. And if you screw up, your screw ups follow you from place to place to place, right? So this is something that's very different here in America. When it comes to many things, we do not have a system. We do have systems when it comes to some things, right? We have a national interstate, transportation system, right? We have the Amtrak train system, which is national. Not a very good one, unfortunately, because it's typically underfunded, not because it's the Amtrak people don't want to do a good job. We have a national postal system, although that's supplemented considerably by all these other ways of delivering packages. But when it comes to education, we do not have a system. We have a Department of Education, but the Department of Education only dictates things at the very, very high levels. What really happens in education depends totally on what's happening on a local and on a state level. Similarly, we do not have a national policing or prison or criminal justice system. We have all sorts of other things instead that I'll talk about in a moment. And we don't have a national healthcare system. As a matter of fact, that's one of the things where we are really at a major disadvantage, as the COVID pandemic has shown us. We have a lot of people who don't have access to healthcare, even after things like Obamacare, and we'll talk about that in a moment as well. So let's talk about education first. But actually, before that, instead of saying, you might say, well, so there's no system. What the hell is there? There are systems, plural, and they interconnect and interlock with each other and sometimes conflict with each other and sometimes don't look the same as each other and sometimes are engaged in polemics with each other and sometimes support each other, sometimes do the opposite of support, hinder each other. And there's, all sorts of permeability to money coming in or corporations or other interests taking a role in it. And a lot of it gets dictated by administrators or by legislators on a local level who may, in fact, be just as bad as our national legislators. We don't have like the best people in office much of the time in either party. I mean, one party is particularly bad. The other party is half and half when it comes to competency. Um, and so we have a whole bunch of interconnected systems, many of which are not what they pretend to be. And so when somebody generalizes about the system, we need to change the system, they're usually laboring under a collective delusion. It's not possible to change the national policing system because we don't have one. It's not possible to change the national education system because we don't have one, right? We could go on and on with examples like this. So let's talk about education. And we're going to break it down into what we call K through 12, which also includes pre-K, pre-kindergarten. K through 12 means through 12th grade, being a senior in high school. So it includes elementary school, middle school, high school, and anything else you might want to call it along the way, like junior high or, pre-elementary, any of those sorts of things. So kids from basically 3 years old up to 18, sometimes 19 when they're graduating. We've got that. And then we've got our college and university systems, what we here in America call post-secondary, education, right? And some people get confused because we have undergraduate and graduate, and that doesn't map exactly onto college and university and other places. So just put the dividing line at like up to high school and then anything after that. So let's talk about K through 12. Who decides how things work? There is a Department of Education, right? And the Department of Education can have certain guidelines, like the Common Core became part of it. Its implementation depends on the local school system. And there usually are systems, right? So a school typically, unless it's an independent private school, is not going to be totally on its own. It'll be part of a school district, or in Indiana, a school corporation, right? My kids went to school corporations. And you might say, what's the difference? Well, a corporation is a corporation. It's, you know, um, ostensibly not for profit, but profit motives get involved in there very easily. And there's a lot of interaction between business and education. Um, so each local area has got its own school districts, and then that has to be funded. Much of the funding comes from local property taxes. And so if you live in a low tax area, you probably don't have a lot of money to educate your students compared to people who live in rich areas which have higher property taxes and which can afford a lot of things. So here in the Milwaukee, for example, the Milwaukee public schools are drastically underfunded. As a matter of fact, if you want to help out students today, you could write a check or make a donation to the Friends of the Milwaukee Public School. Which is a charity that helps out the Milwaukee public schools. And that's because of the way our politics work. The state sometimes puts in some money to help out. Some states do, some states don't. It's totally dependent on which of the 50 states you live in and which of the municipalities you live in. Standards change from state to state. I know, some of you know that, like, in Republican dominated areas, there's this big push to, like, be against critical race theory and, make sure that that won't be a part of our schools, which is, largely bullshit, and, crazy delusion on the part of the people who are involved in it. But be that as it may, they're trying to produce changes within the districts. They're also finding out how difficult it is to really change things for what they view as the better, which would be the worst for most people. And so there's this inertia that's produced. It's very difficult to get things changed or done in many respects unless you control the school board, right? Or you control the particular school. Now, in addition to all these school systems, right, across a particular state, and then each state has got its own patchwork of these things. We have all these independent schools as well, some of which are religious, right? The three largest parochial school systems are Catholic, Lutheran, and Seventh Day Adventist. Interestingly enough, but there's also schools that are run by corporations or organizations that originate in, say, China, right? We've got one of those here in Milwaukee. We have all sorts of other schools that are affiliated with other groups and interests and stuff like that. It can often be difficult to find out accurate information about these, and you often have to do a lot of digging. And they have to teach some of the same standards that each state will apply, but each state is totally different than the other. I mean, if you go to school in a place like Mississippi, the standards are low. As a matter of fact, across the South, with the exception of, like, maybe Virginia, um, standards are pretty low by comparison to Midwestern states and, New England states or New York or, the West Coast or stuff like that. Plain states are struggling immensely with population loss, much of which is younger people. And some school districts may require their students to be bused 2 hours to get to school and 2 hours to get back. Very, very different student experiences, very different parent experiences, very different accessibility to having your voice heard. What goes, 1 mile down the road may not be the case another mile down the road. People don't often realize this until they start getting involved. What about our college and university system? Is there a system? There's no system. There are some basic standards, like you need to be accredited. Well, unless you're not accredited or you're a for-profit college or things like that. Some of them have been reined in. Some of them have been quite predatory, including on military people. Um, Trump University was just one of many examples of fake schools, essentially. Um, Within any given state, and we have, again, 50 states in the United States, you are going to find a state university system which will be, ostensibly one big system, but each university is going to be kind of its own animal. And things are going to be different from one college or university in that system to another. If we take Wisconsin, the two largest ones are Madison, which is the flagship university set in the capital, UW Milwaukee, which is, also very important. That's where my oldest daughter is going, studying musical theater, really great program there. Oshkosh, which is the third largest. And then it's like all these other satellites like, Eau Claire and La Crosse and Green Bay and Stout and, I'm blanking on the Whitewater. Whitewater is the one you go to for business, and each has its own particular thing, and each is its own entity. Similarly, in Illinois, I went to Southern Illinois University, Carbondale. And it's said Carbondale because there's two Southern Illinois universities. There's Southern Illinois University, Carbondale, Southern Illinois University, Edwardsville, right? And then there's Western Illinois, and Eastern Illinois, and Illinois University in Champaign-Urbana, University of Illinois at Chicago, right? All these different entities that are all part of one system, but are being managed quite differently from each other. Then you have all the other schools. Most of our elite schools, the big ones that have gigantic endowments and massive cultural force, they are not public schools. Harvard, University of Chicago, you know, second tier ones like University of Notre Dame that desperately wants to be an Ivy League and is basically sold out a lot of its ethos to try to get that. Marquette University just down the road. Um, these are all private institutions. They may be affiliated with a church, but that affiliation is probably very, very loose at this point in time. So Marquette University is ostensibly a Jesuit university, but they haven't been a Jesuit university for 20 years. They don't live up to any of those values and stuff like that. And each one is its own entity. And you could say, well, there's got to be something that like holds them together, like accreditation. Yeah, there's some regional accrediting bodies, and then there's professional accreditation that you can get. But accreditation, in many respects, is kind of a joke. I actually, got to see not a university, a college lie to the accreditors about some things because I was a consultant actually was getting to see the documents, and I knew that the stuff that they were saying was like complete lies. We have a culture of assessment. They didn't have a culture of assessment, and the accreditors didn't check. So, what do you do in a case like that? And when we talk about things like, um, you know, cancel culture on campus, or we talk about free speech, or we talk about, academic um, freedom, or we talk about admission scandals, you've got to understand this is not something where you can take an instance of one college and then generalize about the whole system because there is no system, right? What happens at Evergreen, and that happens at Evergreen, and that's not happening at the next college down the road unless you can actually show that there's some internal connection. If some speaker is, shouted down at University of Chicago, that doesn't mean a damn thing about, what goes on at Marquette University or even universities within Chicago, like University of Illinois at Chicago, or Dominican or not Dominican, Benedictine, or DePaul, or any of these sorts of things. So just looking at cases, that happen at one particular place doesn't tell us a lot about what's going on at others. And I mean, we can make some really broad generalizations, but that's about it. And if you want to change the policies of places, it is incredibly difficult to do. Let's talk about, so that's education. Let's talk about policing. Policing is even more of a mess. I mean, do we have federal police? Yes, we have all these, like, the ATF, and we have the FBI, and we have the federal marshals. They only get involved in certain kinds of cases, and very often they're like 49 steps behind whatever the locals are doing. And local police departments can be incredibly powerful. Think about the corruption and abuses that have been going on in Chicago Police Department since the beginning, all the way up to today, where we still see terrible things being done by Chicago cops. Not to say that all the Chicago cops are bad. There's some good apples, but they're always at risk of being corrupted by the vast amount of rotten apples in those barrels. Um, right now we're seeing police unions, which really I think don't even have a right to exist because of the terrible stuff that they've done over the years, concealing corruption and abuses. They really ought to be disbanded tomorrow. Police unions standing in the way of COVID inoculations. That where does protect and serve come in? Protect us from the cops and their entitlement and their attitude of we're not going to follow the rules that everybody else in society has to. you know? We have literally thousands, tens of thousands of police departments across the United States, every one of which is its own entity. A cop can be fired for egregious conduct, and it does happen sometimes, in one municipality and go get a job as a cop right down the road in another one. Prime example of this is the guy in Wauwatosa who's killed several people on the job, and he was fired by Wauwatosa. He got hired by Waukesha County sheriffs. So, it's very difficult to hold police accountable. The only exception is, of course, when they're like blowing the whistle on other police, and then they're held accountable very quickly by their own fellow cops. Um, this is very much hindered by the fact that every single town can have its own police department. Every county can have its own sheriff. The state police are the state police, right? And just here in Milwaukee, prime example of this, just a block from here, jurisdictions change. I mentioned that we're very at the very beginning that we're part of Milwaukee Police District 1. If I'm in the park and I see something going on, I have to call not the Milwaukee police, but the Milwaukee County sheriffs because they handle the park, right? So, I mean, not that the Milwaukee police won't necessarily respond, but they'll probably kick it over to the sheriffs. And we have lots and lots of stuff like this. I used to live on a county line, and there'd be something happening across the county line. If I called our sheriffs, they wouldn't do anything about it. I'd have to call the other county sheriffs, right? And if one is corrupt and the other one isn't, that's not connected to each other. You know, um, not to say we can't like try to push politically for police to be held accountable, but it's incredibly difficult because of this factor. Same thing goes for prisons and jails. Every single county has its own jails, right? And then each state has its own Department of Corrections or Bureau of Corrections or whatever they happen to call it. And each one is a separate entity from all of the others. Prisons are terribly, run and regulated in large part. Many abuses go on in American prisons that wouldn't be tolerated in some other places. And it's in part because of the fact that there's no system. There are only systems, and each one requires its own examination and oversight and accountability. And they're not accountable all to the same place, right? Um, Healthcare, another big mess for Americans, right? There is no national healthcare system. You might say, well, what about the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare? What that actually created was state marketplaces where each state would have its own private insurance companies that you then could purchase on the marketplace. And you might get a subsidy for it or you might not, depending on how much money you're making. We were on the Affordable Care Act marketplace here in Wisconsin. Hours and hours and hours of online paperwork, and sometimes things falling through, things not being done right. And it was my wife is the one who handles these things. She is brilliant. She's actually worked in financial things before, and she understands how systems work. And I would hear her on the phone for hours at a time trying to get our coverage and then trying to get it things paid for. And I would think to myself, how would an ordinary person who doesn't have the kind of experience and persistence that she does, how would they actually get their insurance and get it to work for them? Most Americans are still getting their insurance through their employers. If they are getting insurance, it's often quite crappy. Things are not covered. We don't have a national healthcare system. Instead, we have all of these interlocking other systems, and they don't work well together. And many Americans are getting really crappy healthcare as a result. The only exception to this is like, look at when we made vaccines essentially free for people because we want them inoculated against a pandemic that's killing people. It showed what we could do, but we don't do it. Instead, we have, all of these different hospitals, some of whom are actually owned by venture capitalists. They become part of a hospital group, and different hospitals have different standards that they're requiring of their doctors, nurses, orderlies, all the different people. It is just a mess, and it varies considerably, not just from state to state, but from county to county. If you live here in Wisconsin and you live down here in the Milwaukee area, you can get access to quality healthcare. If you live out in the countryside, particularly the farther north you go, it's a crapshoot. You may or may not have access to decent healthcare. It's very dependent on where you live and in part who you know and what you know. So these are three examples of things where there is no system, and to try to reform it, to try to produce a national system, as we've seen, with Democrats trying to introduce something like a single payer healthcare thing. Everybody, oh, I won't get to keep my doctor, and all sorts of bullshit that gets put out there. You see how difficult it is to change these things. We might be stuck with this forever. And, some people might say, well, there is a good side to this: local control, local autonomy. Yes and no. It's some people's local control, the elites, the ones who have access, the ones who know how the system works and are working the system more often than anybody else. There are people, who are doing very well with the American, policing systems and criminal justice systems, or the education systems, or the healthcare system, but they're not the majority of Americans. And if you want to understand why Americans are often so frustrated, why there's this seething resentment. It's not just economic issues of like, oh, jobs have been outsourced overseas. It's because of in super important areas of life, healthcare, education, policing, so many Americans are just screwed, and there's little that they can do about it. It's not just that they can't find jobs, it's that when they come home from their job, or when they take time off from their job to go pick up their kid from school, they find out that crazy crap has been happening at school, or their kids aren't learning anything, or their schools are dumps, and the school right down the road is great. Or they get hassled by the cops, and there's nothing they can do about it because the cops are acting with impunity because there's no overall system, just the system that's in place for that particular municipality. Or they, take time off to go to the doctor and can't get the health care that they need. And when they do get anything, it costs an arm and a leg. By the way, Affordable Care Act, the insurance that we had, you had a huge deductible. And then on top of that, even when you'd met your deductible, you still paid extra. I mean, this is the American, you know, if we want to use the word system, this is the American system, and it's a system of crap. How did we get here? There's a long, long story to be told about that. I'm more interested in a diagnosis of where we stand in the present, and there's a lot of other areas that we could talk about as well, where there is no system, that in where it interlocks with these. Think about libraries and how every single place has its own library system, but there's always this talk about, well, maybe we don't have to have libraries. There's places that want to close them down, and every university has its own library, and all these other things. We could talk about lots and lots of other systems. All right, so let's talk about some of the things that are coming up. Hawkins says, "What do you think about defund the police?" I think that one's pretty much dead in the water as a slogan. We hashed that out, as a society over the last 2 years. It's misleading. I mean, if what you mean by defund the police is hold them accountable and reduce their monetary inputs, you're not defunding them, you're actually regulating them, and you're actually selectively funding them and stuff like that. To talk about totally defunding the police, that's pretty much a non-starter these days. And it's a non-starter in most municipalities. Get your feet on the ground and see what people think in the places that are being most impacted. Once you get past the F the police kind of sentiment, and you say, well, yeah, well, should we get rid of the police altogether? People are like, yeah, that's not really a starter. So we need much more realistic proposals, and we need much more local accountability, and that's not going to come through massive, slogans or anything like that. It's going to come through the persistence of going in over and over and over again and looking at things in the local level and saying we got to do something about this here. you know any other questions, comments people want to make about? I mean, this is different in America than it is in many other places, and I think this is something that is, if you come from a place that has a national healthcare system, you'd be like, well, why don't the Americans just like get their act together and have a national healthcare system, you know? Or, if you come from a place that has one single entity that governs all the police, it's natural that you would think that, well, you could actually change things in terms of policings or prisons pretty easily by bringing politicians to bear. But that's just not the way it is here in America. You know, what other questions do people have or points that they want to make? Or so, Nicholas, how does dialectical materialism apply to politics or political situations? There's no answer to that. I mean, there's no agreement among Marxists about what dialectical materialism means. You bump two Marxists together and you get conflict between them typically, and there's nothing a fellow Marxist will spend more time on than attacking another fellow Marxist. So that I think that's kind of a non-starter. You don't need to do Diamant in order to think about things in terms of class. I mean, we can see that from Marx, who had to attack every other person who thought of things in terms of class as not being good enough. So that one's just not going to get you anywhere. I mean, the other thing you have to think about is if you're approaching things in a very dogmatic way in America, you will never get anything done politically. If you walk into a school board meeting and you're like, here's what dialectical materialism has to say, people just close their ears. I mean, it's the same thing when I'm like doing stuff with virtue ethics. If I'm talking to a bunch of business people, I don't tell them that the stuff about emotional management that I'm teaching them is coming from Thomas Aquinas or the Stoics or Aristotle until they ask. All right. Elijah says, I don't know if you're up to this sort of convo, but is getting rid of the police a non-starter in communities that use consensus and such? Policing is not necessary. Yeah, and there's almost none of them. you know so yes, if you have a community that uses all sorts of other things that are total alternatives to police, cool. That ain't 99.9% of America. And even when you do have something like that, there are going to be cases where you're still going to have to call on the police for something else. So when you say something is a non-starter, you mean it's really not practical. I mean, anything can be imagined, but being able to do something about it, that's something totally different. All right, Ken says, coming from a country with a national healthcare system, the amount Americans have to pay for healthcare is obscene. The NHS isn't perfect, but it's free for users. Yeah, and you can say that about almost any developed country in the world. That I mean, just going to Canada is like should be eye opening for Americans. The amount of stuff that we have to pay there's so much extra costs built in at every single point that don't need to be there and are basically there to make money for medical suppliers and make money for insurance companies and make money for the hospital groups themselves, as I pointed out, often owned by non-medical entities, including venture capitalists. It is really obscene, and it's weird that Americans, for the most part, don't get it and will buy into stupid propaganda like, well, if we had a national healthcare system, we'd have death panels and you wouldn't get to pick your doctor. All you got to do is like look at another country and see that that's BS, right? Eric W has a very broad question: is destruction of property ethically justifiable? Yeah, I mean, we do it all the time. The question you really mean to ask is, when is destruction of property ethically justifiable? And that's a separate topic that we're not going to discuss here. But everybody destroys some property. I'm destroying some right now. I'm destroying this coffee, and I own that coffee, right? The Frosty, liked your point on needing more local accountability for police. Would you extend that same view to areas outside of the police? Yeah, of course. We should have accountability on anything that affects our lives. Education is part of that. Healthcare is part of that. The transportation networks are part of that. When they remove a bus line here in Milwaukee, that drastically affects a lot of low income people's ability to move from place to place. Um, our parks, which we're very fortunate to be blessed with because of our socialist past here in Milwaukee. They thought that parks were an important thing to have, and so we have a lot of green space here. If we don't protect it, I mean, there's actually proposals to like sell off the parks again to various businesses. You really, really have to watch your local government here in the United States, and it can be very dismaying because they often act with impunity because there isn't a lot of accountability. Mark Smith asks, why don't many Americans want to change things? Do you think this is the libertarian culture so prominent there? Would the federal system ever be able to do more there? So I don't think it's the case that most Americans don't want to change things. I think most Americans do want to change things. They want to change them for their picture of the better, and they have no roadmap other than those provided to them by, ideologues in media or by politicians who, either are decent people and then often have very complex proposals that are nuanced, or are just bullshitters who manage to get their way into office and who are lying to the people. It is difficult to figure out how to really change things, and it is demoralizing and dismaying to find out that you can bring a perfectly well thought out rational thing to the school board and get booed and dismissed by a bunch of assholes essentially, or people who want to hold on to power. So I don't think that most Americans don't want to change things. I don't think that it's part of a libertarian culture. Although we do have libertarians, and the Republican Party, I would say right now, is committed to fostering a kind of toxic idea of individuality and freedom that I guess probably does have its roots in libertarian theory, although libertarian theory covers a wide range. But this like freedom without responsibility, and keep everything the way I remembered it as being. Um, that's motivating a lot of fake conservatives because they're not really conservatives in any real sense of the term today. That may be said to have libertarian roots. That might be a good thing to explore later on. Would the federal system ever be able to do more in this stuff? Yeah, if we wanted, if the politicians, here's the problem: the federal system is really run by politicians who manage to get themselves elected in their states, by careerists, and by lobbyists. And the lobbyists are representing the interests of corporations primarily, or other interest groups, not ordinary Americans. Even the ones that claim to speak for ordinary Americans, like AARP, the American Association of Retired People, not really. I mean, it's a massive lobbying group that throws a lot of money around, and I don't think is particularly representative. Um, I don't see a lot of great prospects for the federal government doing an awful lot of help there, but it could be piecemeal. Like, for example, the fact that we now once again have the Pell Grant supporting prison education, the Second Chance Pell program, which took Republicans and Democrats coming together, and which I was participating in for a while here in Wisconsin. That's a sign of a small step forward, right? So it is possible to change some things, but the federal government is, it's great at fighting wars. It's great at, influxing money into things. It's great at pressuring other countries to do stuff, but it's not particularly good at the local level, I would say. I'm going to skip the thing on cybernetics and systems theory because it's not really germane here. Cody, the Finnish journalist Anu Partinen, posits that citizens of Nordic countries have more freedom than Americans because they get government help with necessities like healthcare and education. Yeah, you don't have to posit it. That's a fact. Not having to worry about what's going to happen when I get sick, or my kid gets sick, or my parent gets sick, is an incredible freedom from stress. If you want to get an idea about what Americans used to think freedom looked like, look at Franklin Delano Roosevelt's Four Freedoms speech from back, in the 30s and 40s, and it'll show you how far we've gone. Um, yeah, education, not having to worry that your kid is going to bring home COVID because the school kowtowed to a bunch of, anti-vaccine nut jobs because you're stuck in some red county, like is the case for my kids. Uh, that is for peace of mind. And there's a lot of other things that go along with that. Having an actual robust safety net means that you can move from job to job. So you don't have to be working at Amazon, getting micromanaged and having to pee in jars instead of take a break. Over the course of your life, you can, if you don't like a job, you can switch to it. Now we're in an interesting time with respect to job stuff, because employers are realizing that there's a lot of people opting out, and it's not because of our massive unemployment benefits. That's just Republican talking points and quite silly. I mean, nobody's really getting a lot of unemployment benefits. They're often not enough to pay rent with, let alone, put food on the table and pay your car insurance and all these other things that you need to do. But we're going to see wages going up. Starbucks just announced, $15 across the board because they're scared of not having workers, right? So, all right. Emily Hawkins says, it seems like you think we need an infrastructure to access accountability and dependency across local entities. Are you able to spell out at all what this might look like? No. I'm sure it's not going to be an overall infrastructure. It's going to be people doing things on the local level, and maybe those things catching on when other people are like, wow, here's a prime example. So when we had Hurricane Katrina, right? And everybody evacuated New Orleans. New Orleans residents were located in all sorts of cities like Chicago or San Antonio or all these other places. Only half of them came back to New Orleans. Why? Because living in another place made them look around and say, wow, New Orleans was really fucked up. I can't believe I put up with that bullshit my whole friggin' life. This isn't perfect. I mean, think about Chicago, right? This isn't perfect, but it's like light years ahead of New Orleans in terms of like the cops not, beating me up as much, or being able to find a job, or being able to get access to healthcare or stuff like that. So I think that, having models that are well publicized can do something, but I don't think there's going to be some sort of infrastructure for accountability. I'm not optimistic about that. It has to be done at the local level, Um, so MFDs, something. Do I think Republicans are planning to overturn the 2024 election if Democrats win? If this is true, isn't that essentially violent? Well, of course it's violent if you're overturning an election. Are Republicans planning it? Yeah, probably, but Republicans are so far out in la la land right now. We should probably just assume that if somebody is still supporting the Republican Party, they're a nut job. I mean, you could say, well, what if you live in a red state and all your neighbors are red staters? Well, I mean, I know plenty of people who look around at their neighbors and they're like, holy shit, these people are nuts, you know? So yeah, we can probably count on that. And that's why independents like me are going to be voting anti-Republican probably the rest of our lives, because that party isn't going to fix itself. Eric said, I meant destruction of property in the context of political protest to bring public attention to an issue. Totally depends on the circumstances, right? I mean, you're looking for some general answer about, is destruction of property okay? It depends, like so many other things when we put our boots on the ground. Elijah says, I've been reading a lot about how a more clear definition of right and left in politics is as hierarchy and authority right versus freedom and equality. What do you think of that? I think those are just complete abstractions, and you'd probably do way better not to buy into things like that. Um, Politics is complicated. What counts as right is a vast amalgam of a whole bunch of different motives and groups. Same thing, what counts as left. These things change historically over time. Beware people like Jonathan Haidt, talking about conservatives are all like this, liberals are all like this. That is as crappy as that men are from Mars, women are from Venus nonsense that people spout. I wouldn't buy into that sort of thing. You're going to find both motifs represented in both sides, and it's way more complicated than just two sides, you know. So, um, any other questions, comments? It looks like we've kind of reached the end of uh, of the ones that are posted. Um, I'm going to take the opportunity to have some coffee. Anything in particular about this notion of there not being systems? Because that's really where I want to put the focus today. Mark says, do you think the nation state is a viable form of political community? Depends on the nation state. And if we're talking about political community in any robust sense, the answer is probably no, unless you've got a small nation state. Like, we talk about the Nordic countries. France is probably already a little bit too large, Great Britain, to be able to do that. To have a real sense of community and to have politics, which is deliberation among people about how to move forward. The vast nation states, China, India, the United States, Russia, Brazil, Indonesia, which is a massive country, probably too big to really be anything like a political community in a robust sense, and not just to be a whole bunch of elites and transactional stuff and institutions. Doesn't mean that you can't do decent politics within those contexts, but yeah. Sahil, what are my thoughts on Mark Fisher's capitalist realism? I haven't read the book, so I only know the premise of the book. I think that the idea that we can only think out things within the horizon of capitalism. Um, I mean, we've heard that tune before, right? It was enunciated by Fukuyama. Um, I don't know that it's a hard and fast case. I really do need to read the book. Hawkins, with accountability being established at the local level, I thought you were saying earlier a fundamental issue is that there isn't any connecting system linking these local entities. Yeah, but that's not me calling for an infrastructure. I'm saying that this is the reality that we're in. And yeah, you can establish accountability on a local level. It's hard. You got to be paying attention to what these slippery bastards are doing all the time, and the slippery bastards that aren't in the chambers but are bankrolling people. So if you live in a small town, you got to actually see what the city planners and the board are doing. You know, you can't just wait until the last minute when there's an issue and you're like, oh, we need to go in with signs and say stuff about this. You got to be watching these people all the friggin' time, and that takes time and that takes effort, and that's tough to do. And we need kind of a division of labor when it comes to that. Maybe some of us need to be the ones who walk in and sit in on court stuff, and we're like, well, that judge seems crooked. I better tell somebody about that. And maybe some need to be the ones watching the cops, and some need to be the ones watching the school board and things like that, right? And it requires us to do an awful lot of extra work. Um, all right, Elijah says, I want to say disagree due to how you can still very much track the right and left ideologies throughout history. No, you can't, actually. You can only do that by engaging in massive abstraction and storytelling and stuff like that. The closer you get to the real history, the more you're going to see that's not really the case. Mark says, what form of political community do you think would best allow for local direct democracy? I mean, it seems that part of the difficulty is achieving accountability across multiple levels of authority. Yeah, and avoiding other entities coming in and using their massive amount of economic or political power to screw things up. I would say that in a lot of cases, it's very difficult to stand up against the forces of corporations. What kind of political community would best allow for local direct democracy? I mean, local direct democracy is a political organization, but it's very difficult to have for very long, isn't it? I mean, we do have to have representation, and we do have to have some things that are not elected offices, so the whims of people can't rearrange automatically. Who's getting things done in very boring jobs. Um, All right, let's see. Sahil says, given the rise of technology and in a way a sort of anti-humanist, accelerationist, cybernetic that dwells in the nihilist worldview, where do you personally think things will go? I mean, I don't know that many people who are actually anti-humanist, accelerationist, cybernetic outside of, some very small communities that I participate in. The average person on the street is not like, let's accelerate capitalism and let everything burn, and see what sorts itself out. I think most people are just feeling that they're being drawn along for the ride. That can lead itself to a different kind of nihilism, a nihilism of pessimism and despair, where they're like, fuck it, I can't get anything that I need done. And what am I going to do with my kids? But that's not that sort of all is lost, therefore accelerate thing. Where are things going to go? I don't know. I don't have predictions about that. I'm not a prognosticator myself. Uh, what do you do when so much of the population has become violent, hungry, far right nut jobs? How do you bring them back to reality? You don't. You're not. You're not some sort of person who's responsible for bringing them all back to reality. Massive, long-standing cumulative forces, along with their own decisions, have turned them into what they are. No single thing that you're going to do is going to fix that. I mean, the most that you can do is maintain the connections with the ones that you maybe are related to, and you can push back once in a while if they don't block you or ban you or stuff like that. Like when my dad talks about going to watch Fox News, every once in a while I'll say, you probably should watch something else other than that. You're a smart guy, and why are you feeding yourself crap like that? Um, but there isn't going to be some vast fixing things for these people. I mean, what we're seeing is that as they refuse vaccinations and refuse to wear masks and stuff like that, more of them are getting sick. Unfortunately, it's their poor kids who are also getting sick as well, and they're getting us sick too. So I don't know. It's not like there's going to be some pulling them out of this in some way. And we're at a dangerous point in history because there's so much of this stuff. Um, Shrey says, one of my thoughts on Harry Eckstein's congruence theory. Never heard of the guy, so I don't know. Hawkins, division of labor across the general populace for engaging politics is a really great idea. Any thoughts on how to get started on trying to organize people in this type of energy? None at all. I'm not. I'm saying a division of labor would be needed. I'm not saying that we organize it. I'm just saying that's what would have to happen. I don't know who would organize that. I suspect it's going to be a lot more individual people doing the work and not trying to allot it out and say, okay, you're responsible for this, you're responsible for this. Um, all right. Evil Dust. Most of my family, with the exception of my mother and stepfather, are completely deranged. The things they believe now because of the Trump fad make my head spin is pretty disturbing. Yeah, I mean, Trump catalyzed some of what's worst in American culture and politics. Um, and it's going to be very difficult to change that. You know, I have no problem myself with banning, blocking, not engaging with people who you say are you can tell that there's something wrong with them. Now, some people might say, "Oh, well, you have a duty to engage with them." No, you don't. No more than you have a duty to engage with people who are, part of a noxious death cult. So, you know, Ricky says, my political philosophy starts with the apology, ends with the prince. Well, okay. I mean, anybody can have whatever political philosophy they want, but I mean, dropping names doesn't mean anything. The apology can be interpreted in many ways. The prince can be interpreted in many ways. It's not as if they by themselves as abstractions mean anything. Kevin says, agreed with division of labor for oversight, grassroots, consortium as possible structure, fueled by regional taxes. Getting regional taxes out of politicians to pay for grassroots structure, good luck with that. That might be something that's possible to do in a few states that have their own culture, but that wouldn't fly here in Wisconsin. That wouldn't work at all. Sahil says, do I feel there should be significant investigations on self versus digital self sort of thing that came after the internet? I don't know what significant investigations means here in a political context. So do you mean in the sense of like that should be a theme for philosophy or something? Or are you talking about people impersonating other people? Because we've got these, possibility of creating fake personas in the internet with the digital self. I'm not sure what the actual question is there. All right. So, while there's a pause here, I'm going to say, long story short, I don't have a lot of proposals when it comes to these things. This is more of a diagnosis than a program for fixing things, Mark says, do you think when a given system is failing, it's acceptable for a community to act outside of that system to meet their own needs? I mean, I think that a given system is almost always acting outside of its own system and bringing in outside actors, looking for help elsewhere, models elsewhere. I think that's the normal case for systems, whether we're talking about political systems, economic systems, um, educational systems. There's always no system is a closed entity for very long, Eric, boy, you really just won't let this issue go. What criteria would you use to decide when property destruction for political change is justified? I mean, that's not something I have an answer for right now in a broad, abstract way. I don't know why you're so worried about that particular issue. I would probably look at it in a fairly utilitarian way. If you're putting me on the spot, I would say, what's the point of doing it? And I would also ask, like, is the entity whose property being destroyed, are they able to replace it very easily? It's very different to burn down a single family's house and to burn down a corporate headquarters. The corporations got insurance for that sort of crap, right? It's not the same thing, but I'm not sure why you want to turn this particular issue about systems into answering this thing that seems to be stuck in your craw about that. Dark Lord says, if all the circle people from Aristophanes' speech in the symposium desired, this is not even remotely relevant, so I'm not going to bother with it. Jay, why does the state of Wisconsin arrest and incarcerate so many young black males? Okay, so that's a good tangible question to work on. Racism is a significant part of it. The kind of legislation that we've put into place and the way that policing works in Wisconsin is a major part of it, right? Drug crimes are not like something that's enforced across the board without, respect to race. And there was a massive prison building initiative in Wisconsin under Tommy Thompson, the former Republican governor, in the 1990s. If you know some of the back history of this, and when you build prisons, there's a tendency to want to find people to fill those prisons because those prisons are economic projects. As a matter of fact, there was a point where I remember this in the 1990s where people were pointing out, wow, you're spending more on prisons than you are on education. What the hell's going on there? So that is a massive part of it. We also have some pretty significant segregation and intergenerational poverty here in the Milwaukee area. As you may know, of the large cities in the United States, we are considered the most segregated. You wouldn't guess that from the downtown here, where in the environing areas where everything is very integrated. But go, you know, 3.5 miles north, go 2 miles south, go 5 miles west of here, and you will find some very, very segregated communities, and that's a good part of it. And these are important. These are the sort of important questions to ask, I would say, when it comes to these systems. You don't want to just ask why are African Americans, a higher part of the incarcerated population nationwide, because the answer may be different in some respects in Texas than it is in Wisconsin than it is in California. You want to ask about why in Wisconsin, why in Milwaukee, why in Eau Claire, all of these sorts of things. All right. Anurag, can there ever be a return to fact and honesty from our post-truth soaked age? If you think that there was ever a time of truth and fact and honesty, somebody has sold you a line of bullshit. Because read some political philosophy going all the way back, to Plato, and you're going to find that these are problems we've been struggling with the entire time. Here's an interesting question from Retro Gamer, in the context of a new Duran Duran album, which I'll have to listen to because I'm a big Duran Duran fan. Popular music unites rather than divides. Okay, I think there's something to be said about that in a minute. Doesn't the musician, lyricist, and poet do more for humanity than a political economy? So it depends. I mean, musicians are great at raising awareness. They're not great at producing structural change. Some kinds of music are better at that, but it's very easy for it to get co-opted. I mean, look at how so much countercultural music is now. I mean, my wife and I watch football games on TV, right? And when I hear like AC/DC or Ozzy Osbourne getting played on the football thing, I'm like, holy crap. I mean, when I was listening to that stuff as a kid, the football jocks, that would have been anathema to them to listen to that sort of crap in the stadium. Things can get co-opted super easy. And so I mean, Duran Duran, they're a group that actually called attention to that. Think about their album Pop Trash, right? Which I think was much more successful than U2 and their supposed postmodern albums calling attention to late capitalism. I think Duran Duran's better at that sort of thing than U2 is. Popular music doesn't necessarily unite. It can divide, especially when they take serious stands. Great example of an artist who gets considered divisive, who I'm a huge fan of, by the way, is Lizzo. I think her calling out bullshit is awesome when it happens, but a lot of people, complain about her, and I think a lot of it's, the fact that she's black and overweight and stuff like that, and a woman. All these other things that can roll into it, people's secret hatreds, coming out. But if you're really using your music to take a stand, you're going to be controversial. So a lot of popular music doesn't do that, or they're super vague about it, or they just reinforce stuff. I mean, look at a lot of country music, and how it plays off of traditional gender roles, and apple pie and mom and the American flag and blah 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 blah. I mean, it's set up basically to make insecure white people feel good about themselves, for driving their big truck that they don't need, to their shitty job, right? And we can say similar things about other kinds of music, and some music is just escapist. That was one of the very common criticisms, years and years and years ago about heavy metal, interestingly, in relation to punk, was that punk, oh, it's political, heavy metal, it's just escapism into like dragons and rainbows and swords and stuff like that, right? But look at what happens when bands take political stands. Iron Maiden took political stands. Some of the fan base were like, "Shut up and play." So I don't know about that. I think there's potential for musicians to do things, but I don't think that it's like a natural, better than the boring guy who sits in the back of the public school board thing and is writing notes, and then goes to a blog and types some stuff, and he's like, "Can you believe the bullshit the school board did?" Uh, all right. Chaku, greetings from India. Question: the relevance of international relations is being able to distinctly form theories of political action on the international scale as opposed to state level. Not related to what we're talking about really at all. I mean, the point is, um, this is not about international relations. This is much, much more granular than that. Colors of gaming. Do you believe that emotivism is a huge issue in our political discourse? Do you think trying to move away from that could help our current situation? So emotivism is a meta-ethical theory that's actually it's not really meta-ethical, it's ethical, because all meta-ethics breaks down into ethics sooner or later. And it says that all we really are doing when we're using when we're using moral language, which a lot of political language is trying to express our points of view, our preferences, our emotions, our desires, or to get other people to see things the same way. Yeah, a lot of things are like that. If McIntyre, who is known for making that critique, is right, this has been going on for quite a long time, several centuries actually. And can we move away from it? Yeah, in limited ways. You got to work on yourself first. You're probably not going to change society radically in that way, even if you produce a great book. Um, Elijah, here's a good question. What do you think about the role of walkable cities and urban development in further augmenting these systems? Yeah, so great point about some really concrete things. Urban sprawl playing a big role in schooling job availability. We have a very similar issue here in Milwaukee, which is not a particularly walkable city in a lot of places. We were just having a big discussion about the division of the city. We talked about the segregation in the city. That's going to be produced by widening one of the highways. And the state is pushing this, and the city doesn't want it. And people have pointed out that the net effect of this is going to make it tougher for people from the largely African American, very often in intergenerational poverty, some of the poorest zip codes in the nation, places in the city, to go west and be able to get to jobs. This is very, very important. And it's not just being walkable, although that's a major part of it, but having good public transportation networks. Chicago is at an advantage over Milwaukee because they have the L trains. We just have buses. We do have a streetcar and it's a new streetcar, and it doesn't go very far. It doesn't go to the places that it needs to really produce major change within the city in terms of accessibility. So that's a great point. Mark says, I still see people talk about what happened to the Dixie Chicks. I think they were called, yeah, they were the ones who were country, and then they took a stand against Gulf War II, right? And they were told to shut up and sing. And this happens a lot, you know? I mean, it happens to me in terms of like if I express political views, people are like, stick to philosophy, as if philosophy isn't connected with politics, right? Only explain Aristotle. Don't talk about the implications for American society or stuff like that. Retro Gamer says, don't we need escapism in good measure? There's the key term, good measure, to find ourselves. Yeah. And maybe also to do some self-care. The trouble is that escapism can become just escapism and then produce a kind of passivity or looking away from things that are going on. Elijah says, love that history of music. You see that in hip hop as well, especially in its crossing with metal punk. Yeah, I mean, if you think about like what wasn't at the time old school hip hop, but is now old school hip hop, think about the band Arrested Development. Um, they were very politically active, right? Um, and they had some great songs, and they were critiquing the larger society. They were also critiquing what was going on in the hip hop scene, and I think that that sort of message could be very helpful. And they did draw on other. I mean, hip hop by its own nature, I would say, is a hungry genre in terms of like looking for stuff coming from other places to sample. Um, great example of that in metal is the use of the riff from Jamie's Crying, and what was it in I think Funky Cold Medina. See, my wife would be somebody who'd be able to come up with millions of examples because she listens to a lot more of that. I'm mostly metal. Um, all right. Florian says, what do you think an individual can do to create structural changes in a society? Probably not an awful lot. As an individual trying to create structural changes in societies, you can create avenues for it or possibilities for it. Or if you're super lucky and everything comes together and you happen to be the one who's in charge at a certain point, you can maybe do something. But all you can do is little parts here and there. Sahil, there's a great question. Is representation in arts and media truly important, given in reality the same people are facing human rights abuse? Feels like performative, however good the intent. Yeah, I think that I mean representation can be helpful because it allows people to say, "Oh yeah, that's a possibility for me," or "Finally, we get a chance," or stuff like that. But that's it, right? So Ursula K. Le Guin, in making most of the inhabitants of Earthsea copper-skinned or black-skinned people, as opposed to the white-skinned Kargs, and making her hero Ged a dark man, friends with a much darker man, Vetch from the Southern Isles. She recounts people coming up to her, mostly African Americans, but also other people of color, saying, "It's really important to me that you did this because I finally had a hero I could like see as connected to me." That only gets you so far, and it is liable to co-option. Prime example of this was the United Colors of Benetton stuff that we now use. If you say the United Colors of Benetton, people think tokenism. And when you look at like the brochures or websites for colleges and universities for recruitment, they make sure to like show everybody who's there on campus. They don't show the self-segregation happening in the cafeterias or in the frats and sororities or in the places where students hang out. They don't show the very different, completion rates for colleges or the racism that can happen within the classroom. A student being picked out and being told, "Okay, you're the token so and so. Speak for your people here." Um, Changing that's much more important, right? All right, Thomas, if there is no system but interconnected systems, what are those smaller systems ultimately made of? People and laws, sometimes not, sometimes rules, sometimes regulations, sometimes informal procedures, sometimes histories, sometimes relationships between families. There's no single answer for that. Eric, a lot of folk and country isn't conformist, and you bring up, two examples, Woody Guthrie and Dixie Chicks. Sure, but a lot of it is. So what? You know, I mean, you can always find exceptions to the rule. Um, the shock doctrine. How would you define the concept of meta narrative? I wouldn't define it. I'm not a definitions guy, so that doesn't do much. Elijah says Atlanta has 80% of people stuck in the same socioeconomic status they were born in, largely due to how difficult it is to access better schools, jobs, products without a car. That is a major problem here in Milwaukee, too. That is a major problem, I would say, across American cities. And it also affects people in rural areas incredibly as well. And it affects people who live in suburbs and just don't learn how to drive because maybe they're disabled. This is a significant problem for Americans. It can be for Canadians as well. It's not as big of a problem, I would say, for a lot of people in Europe, although it is a problem in France because so much is centered in the capital. That's what the yellow vests were about: rising gas taxes, and inaccessibility. Um, Kevin has a question about Gandhi that I'm going to pass on here because I don't see it as particularly relevant. Chaku comments on Marshall McLuhan's idea that we have atomized matter, weaponized, and at the same time return to a nomadic state. That I don't think that this has anything to do with the topics here. FA says same goes for all the cities in Turkey. Oh, that's interesting to read. That you really need a car rather than being able to access public transportation or walk around. And Elijah says he's got to leave soon. I actually got to leave myself pretty soon because I got to get to some other stuff. Recommendations, good intro text to political theory. I mean, I'm not a sort of intro text person. When I teach primary texts usually, so I haven't been like surveying anything contemporary that's a particularly good intro text. Um, Intro text to philosophy, metal artists. I mean, I can give you some suggestions about that. Um, with any field, you want to begin near the beginning, but you don't want to be just beholden to the beginning. So if you want to understand what metal was and what it became, and what it still is today, you want to look at the classic artists. I mean, I would actually suggest going to the videos in the classic metal class that Scott Cerulli and I have done over the last couple of years. But what's the beginnings of metal? Something that's recognizable: Black Sabbath, Deep Purple, Uriah Heep, UFO, Scorpions, Montrose, Blue Oyster Cult, Judas Priest. These are like the early on bands that you really want to go to. Led Zeppelin, of course, but Led Zeppelin is kind of an outlier in many respects. And then you want to look at what happened with different movements, like what was going on in the LA scene, what happened with the new wave of British heavy metal, and that'll keep you busy for a while. All right, Sahil, is Machiavelli sort of misunderstood? People say Machiavellian with a negative connotation, which I get. I mean, the negative connotation is not evil or vile; it's manipulative. That's the negative connotation, which I get. And then he stands for freedom. People seem to gloss over that. Yeah, I mean, people should be reading not just Machiavelli's The Prince, but his discourses on Livy if they want to understand what Machiavelli actually stands for. And they want to read The Prince attentively. Too many people read it as if it's like a how-to manual about how to be a manipulative, dominating jerk, when it really has a lot of cool political theory in it. Like when he says, yeah, the rich are going to be pricks to the poor. So you got to find some way to rein those rich people in, He's got a lot of great points like that. So Thomas says Motorhead. Yeah, Motorhead, Tank, a lot. I mean, we could go through a whole list of bands, but this really isn't the time and place for it. Shock doctrine. Are there useful ways to understand the concepts we use in lieu of defining them? I approach politics through definitions mainly. Well, if you approach politics through definition, then you're going to have a very hard time of it because definitions are abstractions, and particularly when they come to things that, as Aristotle says, hold for the most part, they often, are going to have all sorts of exceptions to them. I mean, if you like it being up in your head and just thinking in terms of abstractions, then definitions are great. And do we have other ways of doing things? Yeah, I mean, actually looking at how things are, generalizing from them, which doesn't mean necessarily defining them. Doing family relation definitions or family resemblance definitions rather than trying to do a definition like that. I mean, definitions are great for abstract deductive reasoning, like in mathematics. They're not great for most other things. They're just helpful little tools, and they're only one of many. I mean, we have a lot of tools at our disposal to use. Words. How do you think direct democracy should be implemented? I don't think there's a single answer to that. Referendum, direct votes on issues, councils, government selected by lot, a mixture of different systems. I mean, this presumes that we think that we should have direct democracy. I don't know that direct democracy is a thing that we need to have in every case. I don't want direct democracy when it comes to running a school, for example. I want people who actually know what the hell they're doing to be in charge of running a school rather than like everybody votes. There's some things that I think we should probably vote on, but and there's no one answer to that. I mean, all these things that you're talking about are possibilities, but some of them may be more useful for some communities than for others, right? All right, so I'm going to bring it to a close. A lot of good ideas, suggestions, comments, and stuff like that, but I got to go and upload a Hegel video and get ready for the half-hour Hegel Patreon exclusive session, and also get some food in my belly since I only had a bagel this morning, so woke up kind of late. This has not been a particularly productive month, in part because my wife and I got COVID and flu shots the same day last week, and so massive side effects. And this has been the first day that I'm like feeling really human. So glad all of you could join me. We'll do these again starting next month. It's been a couple months since I've done these, and I might pick one of these other topics and follow up on that. Go back through the comments and stuff and see what else we should follow up on. But I'll see all of you, and yeah, that's about it. All right, see you later.